My boss fired me on a Thursday morning in April and hired my sister to replace me by the following Monday. I found out about the replacement the way I find out about most things in my professional life, through the numbers, specifically through a payroll notification that arrived in my email at 7:43 on that Monday morning because I was still technically listed as a system administrator on the company account and nobody had thought to remove my access before they filled my position with my sister. The notification showed her name, her start date, her salary, which was $12,000 more per year than the salary I had been paid for 4 years in the same role. I read the notification twice. I saved it to a folder I had been maintaining for 11 months. I made coffee. I sat at the desk in the home office of the building I owned and I thought about how to spend my Thursday. My name is Natasha. I am 31 years old. I am a commercial property investor, which is what I do now, though it was not what I was doing 4 years ago when I joined Meridian Consulting as a senior analyst at a salary that was fair but not exceptional and that I had accepted because the role was interesting and the work was real and I had believed, at the time, that interesting work done well would produce the kind of recognition that careers are supposed to be built on. I was wrong about that. What I had not understood yet was that recognition in that particular company flowed through relationships rather than through work, and that the person who controlled those relationships was my boss, a man named Gerald who had built his career on understanding which people in a room were useful to him and organizing everything else around that understanding. I had been useful to Gerald for 4 years. Then I had stopped being useful to him in a specific way that I will explain, and he had fired me on a Thursday morning with 2-week severance and a handshake that had the quality of a man who has already moved on to the next arrangement before the current one has finished ending. What Gerald did not know, because I had been careful to make sure he did not know it, was that the building his company operated out of belonged to me. This is the story of how that came to be, and what happened when Gerald discovered it, and what I said on the afternoon he called me, which was very little, because very little was all the situation required. The building. I need to explain the building because the building is everything in this story and its existence in my name requires some context to make sense. My grandmother passed away 3 years before I joined Meridian Consulting. She had been a careful and quietly wealthy woman who had spent 40 years investing in commercial property in the city she had lived in her entire life, buying buildings when they were undervalued and holding them when everyone else was selling and understanding, with the particular patience of someone who thinks in decades rather than quarters, that the most significant returns come to the people who are willing to wait for them. She left me one building. Not the most valuable one in her portfolio, but a solid mid-sized commercial property in a neighborhood that she had identified, correctly, as being 12 to 18 months away from significant appreciation at the time she acquired it. She left it to me specifically, not to my parents, not to be divided among family members, to me, with a letter that said she had watched me carefully for 20 years and believed I understood the difference between an asset and an expense and that she trusted me to make good decisions with it. I did not tell anyone at work about the building. Not because I was hiding it exactly, but because I understood, from the first week of working for Gerald, that information in that office was currency and that currency held its value only as long as it was not freely distributed. Gerald traded in what he knew about people. I had watched him use personal information about colleagues to position himself advantageously in more situations than I could count across 4 years, and I had made a decision early in my tenure that the less Gerald knew about my life outside the office the better. The building sat in a holding company registered in my name. The lease for Meridian Consulting's office space ran through that holding company. Gerald had signed the lease 4 months before I joined the company, with the previous property management firm my grandmother had used, which had continued managing the building after her death and which had no reason to connect the new owner of the holding company with the new senior analyst who joined one of their tenants several months later. The lease had a standard commercial renewal clause and a specific provision regarding tenant conduct that my grandmother's lawyer had included in all her leases, language about maintaining the property in good standing and operating within the terms of the occupancy agreement, with a notice and cure period of 60 days for any material breach. I had read that lease very carefully when I inherited the building. I had been reading it again, more carefully, in the 11 months before Gerald fired me. The firing. Gerald fired me because I had found something in the company's financial records that he had not wanted found. I want to be precise about this because the firing matters less than what preceded it, and what preceded it was 11 months of me doing my job with more thoroughness than Gerald had apparently anticipated when he hired a senior analyst with a background in forensic accounting. The discrepancy I found was not small. It involved a pattern of billing irregularities across 14 client accounts that, when mapped across 3 years of financial records, produced a picture that no competent analyst could look at and describe as anything other than what it was, which was systematic overbilling, structured carefully enough to avoid detection in any individual instance but visible as a pattern when the full scope of the records was examined. I brought it to Gerald in month 11, the way I bring most things, directly and with the documentation already organized. I placed the analysis on his desk on a Wednesday afternoon and I walked him through it clearly and without editorial comment, because the numbers did not require editorial comment. He looked at the analysis for a long time without speaking. Then he thanked me for my thoroughness and told me he would handle it from here and asked me to keep the matter confidential while he reviewed the appropriate next steps. I said of course. I went back to my desk. I made a copy of everything and saved it to my personal drive. The following Thursday morning Gerald called me into his office and told me my position was being eliminated due to a restructuring of the analyst team. He said it with the smooth efficiency of a man who has made this kind of decision before and has learned to deliver it in the language of organizational necessity rather than personal choice. He said 2-week severance. He said the handshake. He said he appreciated my contributions. I thanked him. I cleaned out my desk. I drove home to the building I owned and I sat at my desk and I opened the folder I had been maintaining for 11 months and I added the termination date and the severance terms and I looked at the full picture of what the folder contained. Then I called my lawyer. Her name was Christine and she had handled the property inheritance and the lease arrangements when I took over my grandmother's portfolio and she knew the building and the lease and the tenant conduct provisions better than anyone. I told her what had happened. I told her about the billing irregularities and the analysis and the Thursday morning termination. I told her I believed the termination was a direct response to the analysis I had presented and that I wanted to understand my options. Christine listened without interrupting, the way she always listened, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said several things in sequence that I found very useful. She said wrongful termination in retaliation for reporting financial irregularities was a well-established cause of action that the documentation I had described would support strongly. She said the billing irregularities themselves, if they were as systematic as I had described, created significant exposure for Gerald and the company across multiple dimensions. She said the lease, which she knew well, contained the tenant conduct provision that I was also thinking about, and that a company engaged in systematic client overbilling was operating in a way that a reasonable reading of that provision would find material. She said, "What would you like to do?" I told her I wanted to wait 60 days. She asked why 60 days. I told her because that was the notice period in the lease before the conduct provision could be enforced, and I wanted everything to be procedurally correct before I did anything at all. Christine said she thought that was very sensible. I thought so too. I spent the 60 days working. Not on anything related to Gerald or Meridian Consulting or the lease or the billing irregularities, at least not directly. I spent them working on my property portfolio, which had grown in the 3 years since I had inherited my grandmother's building from 1 property to 4, through a combination of careful reinvestment and the particular patience she had modeled for me across 20 years of watching her make decisions that other people could not see the logic of until several years later when the logic became obvious. I also spent some of those 60 days thinking about my sister. Her name is Divya. She is 2 years older than me and we have always had the particular relationship of sisters who love each other genuinely and understand each other imperfectly, which is probably the most honest description of most sibling relationships if people were willing to be that precise about them. Divya had joined Meridian Consulting the Monday after my Thursday termination, which meant she had either been in conversation with Gerald before I was fired or she had been approached and accepted with a speed that suggested the conversation had been brief and the decision had been easy. I did not ask her about the timeline. I did not call her the Monday she started or the week after or at any point during the 60 days. We had a family dinner in week 3 of the 60 days at my parents' house, the kind of regular gathering that continues regardless of what is happening between the people at the table, and Divya and I sat across from each other and talked about ordinary things and neither of us mentioned Meridian Consulting and my parents, who knew I had left the company but not the circumstances, Asked how things were going and I said well and Divya said well and the dinner continued. I was not angry at Divya. I want to be honest about that because I think it would be easy to read this story as being about two sisters in conflict and it is not that. Divya had taken a job that was offered to her. The job happened to be mine and the salary happened to be $12,000 more than I had been paid for the same work for 4 years, but those were facts about Gerald rather than facts about Divya, and I had learned a long time ago that directing anger at the instrument of a situation rather than its architect is a way of staying busy without getting anywhere. My focus was on the architect. On day 58 I sent Gerald a formal notice through Christine, on the letterhead of the holding company that owned the building, citing the tenant conduct provision of the lease and providing the required 60-day notice that a material breach had been identified and that the company had 60 days to cure the breach or face the consequences outlined in the lease agreement. The notice did not use Gerald's name. It was addressed to Meridian Consulting as a corporate entity, the way all formal lease communications were addressed. It cited the specific provision and the specific conduct and it was written in the precise legal language that Christine used for all such communications, clear and unambiguous and completely impersonal. Gerald received it on a Thursday. I know this because Christine had arranged for delivery confirmation. He called the holding company's management number that same afternoon. The call went to Christine's office. Christine called me after she spoke with Gerald. She said he had called in a state of significant agitation and had demanded to know who owned the holding company and why they were sending conduct notices to a long-standing tenant in good standing. She said she had explained that she was not able to disclose ownership information beyond what was in the public record and that the notice was a standard legal procedure triggered by documented conduct that met the threshold specified in the lease. She said he had asked what conduct specifically and she had read him the relevant section of the notice, which cited systematic billing irregularities across client accounts as conduct materially inconsistent with the professional standards clause of the lease agreement. She said there had been a long silence after she read that section. Then she said he had asked, very quietly, whether the holding company had any connection to a former employee named Natasha. Christine said she had told him that she was not able to comment on that question. She said the silence after that was even longer. I asked Christine what she had advised him. She said she had advised him, in her capacity as the holding company's legal representative, that the most productive response to the notice would be to engage his own counsel and to begin a genuine remediation of the conduct cited, and that the 60-day cure period was a genuine opportunity rather than a formality. I asked what she thought he would do. She said she thought he would spend the first 2 weeks trying to find out who owned the building and the next 2 weeks understanding that it did not matter who owned the building because the lease provision was enforceable regardless and the documentation supporting it was thorough. She said thorough in the particular way that she had said it before, with a slight additional weight that told me she was referring to my documentation specifically. I thanked her. I went back to work. The meeting. Gerald requested a meeting in week 3 of the cure period. Not through Christine. He called me directly, on my personal number, which told me he had either figured out the ownership or had decided to proceed on the assumption that Christine's refusal to deny it meant the assumption was correct. I agreed to meet him. Not because I owed him a meeting but because I wanted one, because there was something I wanted to say to him in person that I had been carrying for 11 months and that the formal legal process, for all its satisfying precision, did not provide a vehicle for saying. We met at a coffee shop near the building. His building. My building. He arrived before me and was sitting at a corner table with the particular posture of a man who has spent several weeks in a situation he did not anticipate and has organized himself into the performance of composure because the alternative is visible distress. I recognized the posture. I had seen it across a conference table many times when a client received analysis they had not expected. I sat down. He said he had confirmed the ownership of the holding company. He said it with the flatness of someone delivering information they are still processing. I said I was glad the records were clear. He asked how long I had owned the building. I told him 3 years. I told him my grandmother had left it to me and that I had continued the existing management arrangements when I inherited it and that when I joined Meridian Consulting several months later I had seen no reason to disclose a property ownership that had no bearing on my professional responsibilities. He asked why I had not disclosed it when things became complicated. I told him because nothing about my property ownership changed what the analysis showed or what the right response to the analysis was, and that if he had handled the billing irregularities the way a company in good standing handles them, which was to remediate them and report them appropriately, the conduct provision in his lease would never have become relevant. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted 3 things. I wanted the billing irregularities remediated fully and reported to the affected clients with appropriate restitution. I wanted the documentation of my termination corrected to reflect that my position had not been eliminated but that I had resigned, which was a distinction that mattered for my professional record. And I wanted the lease renewed on its current terms without an increase, for 5 years, because the building was a good asset and Meridian Consulting was a functional tenant when it was operating within the terms of its agreement. I did not ask for my job back. I did not ask for an apology. I did not ask for the $12,000 salary difference my sister was being paid for my work, because my sister had not set her own salary and the number was not her fault. Gerald looked at the table for a long time. Then he said he would need to speak with his counsel. I told him the cure period had 31 days remaining and that Christine was available to coordinate with his counsel directly. I finished my coffee. I thanked him for making time. I walked out of the coffee shop into the afternoon and I stood on the street outside the building for a moment, looking at the facade the way I look at all my properties, assessing the structure, noting what was holding it up and what needed attention. It was a good building. My grandmother had chosen well. The remediation was completed in full within the cure period. The lease was renewed on the terms I had specified. My professional record was corrected. Divya is still at Meridian Consulting. We had a conversation about everything, eventually, at a family dinner 3 months after the meeting with Gerald, the kind of conversation that takes a long time to have and leaves things different afterward in ways that are not entirely comfortable but are honest. She said she had not known about the building. I told her I knew that. She asked if I was angry at her. I told her I was not angry at her. I was grateful to her, actually, because the Monday morning payroll notification with her name and her salary had been the thing that clarified, finally and completely, what the 11 months of documentation I had been maintaining were for. She did not entirely know what to do with that. I did not need her to. The building knew what to do with it. The lease knew. Christine knew. And Gerald, sitting somewhere in my building on the 5th floor of a property that had belonged to my grandmother and belonged to me and would belong to whoever I chose to leave it to after me, knew most of all. If someone fired you without understanding what you were holding, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe for the next one. This is Hidden Truth Revenge, where the truth always finds a way.